Welcome to Putback on SNY.TV. I'm Ian Begley. We've got Fred Katz from The Athletic. We got Michael Scotto from Hoops Hype, and we're going to talk the Knicks and NBA trade deadline here coming up on February 9th, 3 p.m. Plenty to discuss. Gentlemen, let's start with OG Anunoby out of Toronto. It's going to take a lot for Toronto to get off of Anunoby. I know that the Knicks, in at least one conversation with Toronto much earlier this season, expressed comfort with getting off of 3 first-round picks to get Anunoby. Plenty has happened with the Knicks since then. Let's go to you, Michael Scotto. What are you hearing on Anunoby, and where do you think it goes?
I think first off, Ian, I think the biggest news of the day is today's your birthday. Wanted to wish you a happy birthday. Hope you enjoy all the day brings in the year ahead. Switching back up to OG, though, I would say that, there's been a lot of talk, certainly around the league, for a guy that is a two-way player on the wing. A lot of teams are coveting that type of guy right now. When I first heard the news about him kind of being available, a couple of teams popped out in speaking with executives. I touched on it with Hoops Hype that the Memphis Grizzlies are a team to keep an eye on because they do have a bunch of picks. They have Danny Green's expiring contract. And theoretically, if they wanted to try to include him, a Canadian at that, Dylan Brooks, who's also a two-way player and a stout defender that could potentially be someone that Toronto would look at. They obviously love having Canadian players on their team. Mm-hmm. Obviously, with the Suns, you've got a young guy in Cam Johnson that they didn't come to a long-term extension with before the season. He was dangled in trade talks with Kevin Durant. That's one piece I would look at there. And then two other teams I think stick out to me, Ian. I would say just given the number of draft picks they have coming up, the New Orleans Pelicans, if they really wanted to go all in and push their chips into the center of the table. And I think another team you got to look at is the Portland Trailblazers. Portland had talked with Toronto about OG previously, and Toronto wanted the 7th overall pick and more, but it didn't go through. Portland was trying to dangle that. They ended up taking Shaedon Sharpe. There's some people in Portland that believe he could potentially be an all-star down the line. But given where they're at with Damian Lillard, would they be willing to part with him? You also hear some rumblings about Josh Hart and Yusuf Nurkic being available. Toronto has not had a true center in a long time, and Josh Hart is a guy that could fit on any team. So there's certainly a lot of different pieces and teams that could be in the mix for OG, but those are some of the teams I'm looking at right now for OG Anunoby in Toronto.
Yeah, so if you're a Knicks fan and you want OG, there's going to be plenty of competition there. The Knicks, obviously, they have the draft picks and they have the young players to put together a competitive offer, and whichever team trades for OG, they have to be sure that he's going to want to sign an extension, re-sign there when he's up in free agency in a couple summers. Fred, where do you see an OG fit in New York, and what do you think New York would have to give up to actually be in the conversation?
Well, from what it seems like to me, it seems like the Knicks are kind of negotiating or have negotiated on the standpoint.
Oh, we lost Freddie. So I'm going to say that for the New York to be in the conversation on OG, you're talking about one of Quickly and Obi Toppin. I think that's obvious. And you're talking about really valuable first-round picks, and then you salary match, and you probably have to throw another young player in there, again, just to be in that conversation. And I think, too, that you're also in touch with Anunoby's side, trying to figure out, hey, would he extend with us? Would he want to be here if we give up all of this to get him? So there's a lot of different moving parts, Mike, as you know, on a trade like this. And if you are the Knicks, what's your best offer for Toronto on Anunoby?
Well, I think you hit on some of the key young guys in Obi Toppin and Emmanuel Quickly. I think, Ian, one thing that you've got to take into consideration here, OG represented by Clutch Sports, obviously the New York Knicks with Cam Reddish, a fellow Clutch Sports client, and hasn't gone the way that either side wants. I think there's going to have to be a little bit of a mending of the fences there. If you're going to get a guy like OG as well, and as you touched on, to look at him long-term potentially. This is a guy that's well coveted around the league. Eventually down the line, his contract is going to be well north of $20+ million annually. You've got to take that into account as well. So with that in mind, I think for the Knicks, certainly their own draft picks are more coveted than some of the other future first-round picks that they have. I would say to you from an optics perspective, I think it would be a little bit tough for them to dangle those for OG when the Donovan Mitchell trade did not come to fruition. As you know, in the New York media, fans are highly tuned into all the different type of moves that their team can make, and they're going to compare these type of talks and transactions if it comes to fruition. So if I'm the Knicks, I'm not trying to give up my first round picks. I think they're more valuable. I would try to start with the back end from the other teams down the line, see if we can make that come to fruition. And Toronto's going to try to get the least amount of protections as possible on these picks. Certainly, I don't think a lottery protected pick is going to do much. I don't even think a top 10, honestly, given the talks that they had with Portland at the draft when they had the 7th overall pick, Ian.
Certainly competitive landscape out there and a lot of different things for the Knicks to consider. Mike, you hit on a lot of it. And Fred, I'm wondering for you, what's the fit for OG Anunoby? I mean, obviously he fits on any roster, but what would the moving pieces look like for the Knicks? Let's say you put together a hypothetical trade, then tell me who's moving out of rotation and how does Tom Thibodeau make it all work if you do land Anunoby?
So I will say, before I say anything else, is that OG Anunoby is one of the best role players in the NBA. He is a phenomenal defender. He's not a very good defender. He's a fantastic defender. He is probably the most important guy to the way that Toronto plays in terms of just kind of their scrambling defense. They switch like crazy. They force a lot of turnovers, and he is the guy. They have a lot of defenders like that, but he is the top dog on that team in order to make that happen. His three-point shot has gotten better. He's really good from the corners, especially. So you plop him onto any team, and he's going to make that team better. But the price for him, like you guys have discussed, is going to be super, super high. And Mike, you talk about how the Knicks aren't really going to be able to include those protected picks they have from other teams. Detroit, Washington, like those won't really move the needle. If you're giving up a ton for him, and it's going to take at least a couple of unprotected picks because of the way the market has just ballooned for role players right now, you want someone who is going to come in and fit perfectly. I wonder how the fit would be with him in terms of just making him as good as he could possibly be with the Knicks. Just because I imagine if you say basically the Knicks are holding on to their starting lineup for the sake of argument, I imagine he comes in for Quentin Grimes, independent of fit, right? Because RJ Barrett is your guy who you just paid the most money on the team to. Like, he is going to stay there, which means that without Grimes, you're kind of losing your connector. You're losing your top three-point shooter. You're losing maybe the best and most willing passer in the starting lineup, which hasn't had the best and most willing passing. So I wonder exactly how that's going to work. The Knicks also don't switch a ton, which is Anunoby's greatest strength on defense, really. So I wonder exactly how they would maximize him, or if they would change their defense completely because of his presence. He's an excellent player, and he's excellent at a lot of stuff. But I'm curious to see exactly how they would go about using his strengths, because the Knicks scheme very differently from Toronto. And Toronto has struggled a lot in the half court, and he's been, it's not exactly like he saves a half court offense. So I'm really curious to see exactly how that would work if they were to land him.
Yeah, so many different ramifications there post-trade if it were to happen. But it's not Anunoby or bust here at the deadline. There's plenty of other names out there. I know the Knicks had expressed some interest in Saddiq Bey previously with Detroit. I think Malik Beasley is going to be always on their radar, considering how they were interested in him. This regime, Leon Rose and his group, were interested in him the last time he was available. So plenty of different names out there. Mike's done a lot of reporting on the Milwaukee connection and what that might look like with Cam Reddish and other players. But let's start with Bey. I'm of the belief that Detroit's more likely to keep him than not. Mike, what are your thoughts on Bey, and what other players do you have linked to the Knicks in terms of possibilities?
Well, Ian, I think your assessment on Saddiq Bey and what Detroit would like to do with him is accurate. They're not going to part with him unless they can get a first-round pick back. This was a guy that was, I believe, a top 20 pick, if I recall, when he was drafted for them. Slightly underwhelming production compared to last year, but not that much. It's relatively on par. My sense in talking with people in Detroit is that they wanted to see what this young core would look like. And in addition to that, Bojan Bogdanovic as well, they wanted to see what they could be. It didn't come to fruition with Cade Cunningham getting hurt, but Killian Hayes has had a chance. Ultimately, they're trying to compete next year and be a team that competes for a play-in spot and potentially a playoff spot down the line. Now, how Saddiq Bey factors into that for them has been a little bit in question because he's had a varying role this year. But I don't think Detroit is going to get the first-round pick compensation that they want for him at this time. And so I think he's ultimately going to stay there. And then you touched on a couple other names. You touched on Malik Beasley. Ian, I could tell you, I don't think that there's a bigger advocate for Malik Beasley than Knicks basketball advisor Gerson Rosas. Remember, Gerson's the one who signed him to the 4-year, $60 million deal when he was in Minnesota. And I can tell you that when Malik Beasley was going through the pitch from the Minnesota Timberwolves, that it was the New York Knicks at that time that reached out and tried to express interest then. So a little too late on that end with the timing there, but they do have interest in him. But I'm curious if that's universal throughout the Knicks management. And lastly, you touched on, obviously, my reporting with Cam Reddish. With Cam Reddish and the Bucks, I think, for the Knicks, it's going to be interesting to see if the Bucks get Jay Crowder. I think if they do, that may move the needle towards the Bucks not having as much interest in Cam Reddish. So there's a lot of dominoes here, but those conversations with the Bucks have remained in play, and they've gone back and forth. So we'll see now within a week under to the trade deadline if they make it happen. Ultimately, at this point for the Knicks, if they can get a second-round pick and matching salaries for Cam Reddish, I think that's pretty much what it's going to be at this point. I know there was a little bit of rumbling out there about Cleveland as well. Some mixed thoughts on him from people I know in Cleveland. But again, Cam Reddish is a guy predominantly around the league that people think is a talent, and they believe on their team he could thrive. He's had 2 chances so far. We'll see if the third time is the charm.
A couple quick things on Reddish. Just wondering why he doesn't even see the floor for New York, even in garbage time. I think it's 20 plus something DNPs. And I did hear that at some point, he was benched for the Cleveland game. I think it was December 4th. Some point before that, he had expressed displeasure with his role and how Tom Thibodeau was using him to a Knicks assistant coach. And he hasn't seen the floor since. I don't know if that was a factor, him expressing that displeasure. I have no idea if that was a factor in him not playing, but just a situation where you kind of scratch your head with the Knicks trading the future first-round pick Kevin Knox for Cam Reddish and how things have played out since. I'm with Mike. I think if they get a second-round pick and can salary match, they'll call it a day. But I do know, his side expects to be moved at the deadline. And if there's no trade at the deadline, they're not going to be very happy, satisfied with him continuing to collect DNPs in New York. So certainly a situation for the Knicks to deal with, handle, assess ahead of that February 9th deadline. It's going to be interesting to see how it proceeds. Fred, with you, what names are you keeping an eye on outside of Anunoby, and then just your thoughts on Cam Reddish?
Yeah, I think with the Knicks, I think Eric Gordon is somebody who could make a lot of sense for them. And the thing you keep hearing with Houston is that Houston wants a first-round pick back for Gordon. Mm-hmm. Houston, that is Houston's MO though, right? I've heard of stories of Houston saying that they want a first round pick back to fill in the blank player, and then they end up not moving him because they kind of overplayed their hand. We'll see if they come off of that for Gordon. He has a non-guarantee in his contract for next year. The thing I keep coming back to with the Knicks is that they like to get creative with their contracts, right? They had that stretch where they were giving everybody team options, right? Which kind of opened up flexibility for them. And with Gordon, he's somebody who has playoff experience. He's a shooter. He can create off the dribble, which is something they really need. And historically, he's a good defender. He's in a situation now with He's playing with a bunch of young guys. They don't really know how to play team defense yet. And you can tell he's very openly frustrated with that situation in Houston. I'm not willing to just like hang up his defense and say that he can't guard anymore just because he's in that situation. He screams change of scenery. And the thing that I think is really interesting with someone like Gordon, or even Gary Harris, who's in Orlando and is shooting 40-some-odd% from three right now, and would kind of play a similar role, guy who guards hard, plays shooting guard, shoots threes, that kind of stuff, is those guys have non-guaranteed contracts for next season. And so the Knicks really like those mid-sized contracts because the goal, as we all know, is for them to try to trade for a star at some point down the line. And if they can compile together a bunch of those mid-sized contracts, then they can put something together that can actually help and just be draft pick laden, and maybe they don't lose any really important rotation players because of it. And Gary Harris, $13 million non-guarantees that they could guarantee for a trade for next year if they found something, maybe on draft night or over the summer if they wanted to move back that guarantee date. Same thing with Eric Gordon, which is another sort of $21 million non-guarantee for next season. I think looking at those sorts of contracts is something that would make a lot of sense for the Knicks. And obviously those are guys who could help them in the short term. Someone like Gary Harris, I have to imagine. I mean, a Gary Harris trade would remind me almost of like the Courtney Lee trade from 5 years ago when Memphis gets him for 2 second-round picks on expiring. Like that's the sort of deal that you could probably get for a guy like that, where it's kind of a short-term upgrade, which actual long-term ramifications, if only because of the way their contracts are structured.
It makes a lot of sense, Fred, when you're talking about the players like a Harris or a player like that's just there to kind of help you for this season, and then you have flexibility moving forward. I think when you're talking about non-Anunoby deals, looking at those kinds of players where there's not a big-time commitment beyond this season that's already guaranteed makes a lot of sense. One player that is on the roster that some Knicks fans are having questions about in the wake of the Los Angeles Laker game, RJ Barrett. Fred, I want to start with you here with Barrett not playing, I think, the final 11 minutes of that Laker game. Barrett, always very accessible with the media, always makes himself available, was not in the mood to discuss things after that game, declined to comment. I think I can understand why, if I'm guessing correctly. But your thoughts on Barrett and him not playing down the stretch late and what happened after that game against LA?
Yeah, I was actually in the Laker locker room when that happened, so I can't speak to his body language or anything like that. I will say that RJ Barrett is extremely accessible and actively wants to talk to media after games, after practices, whatever. It's like an actual personality trait of him. So him not wanting to do it, I definitely consider to be a notable thing. I didn't have a problem with the coaching decision of him not playing at the end of that game. I mean, he was really struggling defensively, especially against Russell Westbrook, had blown by him a number of times, and he was struggling defensively, and it's not like his offense that night was canceling it out. And Emmanuel quickly was in the midst of a really strong game. I mean, I think this is something that has been building up lately, where, we've seen Tom Thibodeau sort of close with quickly over Barrett, but not technically close with quickly over Barrett. It started about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. What he would do is when he starts playing Barrett with the second unit, he sits him for a long stretch in the middle of the fourth quarter and then brings him in closer to the end of the game, as opposed to like 6 minutes left, or bring him in with 3-4 minutes left. But there have been 3, 4, 5 times where he subbed in RJ Barrett for literally the last minute of the game, and he subbed in Barrett for quickly. And I asked him about that recently, and Tibbs said, "Oh, it's just the flow of the game. Not really any subs, and we're just playing Barrett more with the second unit, so you have to space that out more." And obviously, quickly has been on such an impressive run that you want to be able to leave him out there. But it's just notable to me that you have this guy RJ Barrett, who you drafted number 3, and he's in his 4th year. And he's certainly stagnated in some ways this year. I think he's a little bit of a better scorer, but the passing is about the same as it was last year. And I think he's struggled in moments defensively, while quickly has taken certainly this leap from where he was at last year. And quickly is getting more and more, if you consider closing time, 5 minutes, 6 minutes left, quickly is absorbing more and more of those minutes as we go on, for whatever the reason. And it certainly felt, especially over the last 2 or 3 weeks, like it was building to something like this. I mean, Tibbs has 4 non-centers. Brunson, which means at some point you're going to have either Barrett or Quickly or Grimes on any given night not happy because they're not closing. I think this is something that we kind of have to continue. We're going to have to kind of continue to get used to, because one of those guys who kind of all feel like important players, all feel like starters, one of those guys is just not going to be out there with closers consistently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Michael, we know how the Knicks feel about RJ Barrett because they signed him to the extension amidst those Donovan Mitchell trade talks, and we know where they value him. You talk to a lot of teams around the league. What do you hear from teams in terms of their thoughts on Barrett, where he is now, and what his ceiling might be?
Well, Ian, when you talk to teams around the league and other executives, one of the prevailing thoughts is it seems like the Knicks could have almost sold high on RJ after that second season when he shot 40% from three. They thought there was going to be a next step in progression. It hasn't come to fruition in terms of him shooting the ball. He's consistently gotten off to slow starts to the season for whatever reason. But I think when you talk to other executives, their best shot, if they were going to do something with him in a trade, would have been with Donovan Mitchell. Now, there was conflicting intel I got whether Utah was high on RJ Barrett or not in any Donovan Mitchell trade talk scenarios. But, just around the league, look, there's no question he's a hard worker. Whatever his ceiling is, RJ Barrett is going to maximize it. But I think with that said, the question now has become, is that ceiling an all-star guy? That's not necessarily a given at this point. And I think that other executives around the league are noticing that in terms of their evaluation of him. Normally when you see a guy get drafted that high, you're looking at a guy to do a max contract with a team. That's not what happened with the Knicks. It was less than that. And, once the Donovan Mitchell trade talk fell through, they pivoted that way. I think for RJ, he's a great guy as a person, does well with the Knicks media. And like I said, I do think, and I agree with this assessment from other executives, he will maximize whatever his ceiling is. I think, though, there's more question now than there has been in the past about whether that ceiling is at an all-star caliber level or not.
Yeah, one thing about RJ Barrett with those Donovan Mitchell talks, Utah wanted Barrett in the deal. He was a precursor to almost any deal that would have worked. And I know that when those talks were happening, other teams in touch with the Jazz felt like Utah was going to be open to talking about then trading RJ after acquiring him for picks. So just an interesting little wrinkle in those talks. And with regards to RJ, down the stretch, Fred hit it. He nailed everything. Somebody's going to be sitting among those young guys who can make a case to be playing in that role every night. So something for Tom Thibodeau to juggle. One of those young guys that Fred Katz has written a fantastic article about. I recommend everybody go check it out on The Athletic. Manuel Quickly, you did a great job, Fred. I got to see the process a little bit of how it all came together, and it's fantastic. So go check it out. You're going to learn a lot about Emmanuel Quickly. But Fred, for Quickly, what was your biggest focus when you were doing your reporting on him, and what surprised you the most about what you found?
Thanks, man. I appreciate you saying that. I would say I'm just really intrigued by this guy who came into the league as basically an instant offense scorer, right? His rookie year, he was really good. He made first team all rookie, but he did it because he would give them scoring punch off the bench, and they were better when he was there. But he was almost like if he's not scoring, then he's not really helping all that much kind of player. And the guy who he was compared to the most was Lou Williams, which is a very flattering comparison. He's a 3-time Sixth Man of the Year and really one of the best and most efficient scorers of his generation, and an excellent passer too. But the implication was that Emmanuel Quickly is viewed as this sort of instant offense Sixth Man of the Year type player, and that's how people projected him. And now you look at him and think, man, if he could only even out his jumper, he could really have everything, because he's become especially this phenomenal team defender. And you watch the way that he plays, and you watch the way the Knicks use him. They like putting him in the weak side corner, which has so much responsibility in a Tom Thibodeau defense, because it requires somebody to come all the way into the lane when there's help, and then close all the way back out on shooters. And you need someone really fast, and you need somebody smart. And I started paying more attention to his defense and realizing, oh my goodness, he's he's directing everything. You watch them in transition, he's the guy pointing at everybody. And you watch them in the half court. And normally you see a center who's kind of directing everything because he's like, a catcher on baseball. He's got the sight line to the whole field if you're a catcher, and the same thing with a center. If you're in the paint, you got the sight line of the whole court. Very hard to do from the top of the key. I notice he's directing guys from the top of the key. And I'm wondering, how is he doing this? And he's right. He's telling guys where other teams are going to go. And he was nice enough to talk to me about kind of how much pride he has in becoming that sort of high IQ defender, and why he's able to recognize those things, how he's basically memorized every team's playbook, and he sees little actions up at the top of the key, so he knows what the guys behind him are going to do, and he calls those things out for his teammates. And Mitchell Robinson had some really hilarious quotes in there too, which I think it's worth it just to read Mitchell Robinson say, "Slow your roll, bucko." But it was really interesting hearing Quickly's observations on team defense and how he got better. And the Knicks defense is almost 14 points per 100 possessions better when he's on the floor. And for context, I mean, that sounds like a huge number. And then you put it in an even greater context and it sounds even huger, which is the best defense in the league right now belongs to the Memphis Grizzlies. The difference between the Memphis Grizzlies points per 100 possessions and 14 points per 100 possessions worse is the difference between the number one defense in the league and one that would be the worst defense of all time if it belonged to a team. It's a crazy, crazy jump. The second best figure in the league belongs to Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Is it like 8.5 amongst players who played as many minutes as Quickly? He's really, really making a difference for the Knicks defense when he's on the floor. You look at any line of construction, basically, and if Quickly is there, they're good defensively. And I think a lot of it is just because so much of defense is being in the right place, just making sure you're there to disrupt something. And it's not just that he's in the right place, it's that he's directing other guys to be in the right places. And when you have 5 guys who are just on a string in the right place, you are more often than not going to be really pestering defensively. And that's what we're seeing when he's out there playing.
Yeah, just a lot of great insight in that piece. Fred just shared some of it, but there's a lot more, so go check that out. And with Quickly, Michael Scotto, we both know the Knicks had conversations about Quickly earlier this year, potential trades, and then he started to really play incredibly well when the Knicks went to that 9-man rotation. They won 8 games in a row earlier this year, and I think a lot of things cooled down around him. But Knicks still having a decision to make ultimately on extending Quickly, extending Obi Toppin. Some teams talked internally about Toppin and, assuming that he will be available when it comes down to February 9th. I know at least one team has talked to the Knicks about him. What do you think happens at this deadline with Quickly and Toppin, if anything?
I would say out of the two of them, I think Quickly has a better chance of staying than Obi Toppin. I think Quickly, when you talk to teams around the league, viewed as a guy that's a combo guard off a bench. I know when he started, he did well for the Knicks in place of RJ Barrett, and that did help his value around the league. But I don't know if the Knicks are going to be able to get a first-round pick for him as they would have liked earlier in the year. Some teams that checked in previously, as I had reported on Hoops Hype, when the Wizards were down almost their entire point guard depth chart, they checked in. The Milwaukee Bucks checked in as well, as they were looking for at the time an upgrade over Javon Carter and George Hill, and some other teams as well. But ultimately for the Knicks, I think most people around the league would say that Obi Toppin is more gettable of the two of them, because ultimately if Julius Randle is going to play about 37 minutes a night, there's not much runway for Obi Toppin to really have an opportunity to get playing time and to really harness his full potential. So I think certain teams around the league notice that and are intrigued by his talent. I think he's going to be more for other teams than just a guy that's floating out in the corner as he is with the Knicks offense, occasionally getting some alley-oops on backdoor opportunities. So that's the assessment around the league on those two.
Fred, what do you think in terms of Toppin, both at the deadline and also long-term? Where do you see his future with the Knicks, given what we've all watched this year? Not a big role. I will note he shot really well since he's come back from injury. I think he's well above 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since coming back from injury. 40% from beyond the arc since com in about 11 minutes a game. Fred, where do you see Toppin not only the next couple of weeks, but also long-term with New York?
It's difficult to see his role ever really expanding if he's going to be with the Knicks. Julius Randle is still under contract for 3 more years after this one. And in some ways, Julius Randle seems like the most untradeable player on the Knicks, right? And when I say that, I don't mean most difficult to trade like most people need it. I mean, when Julius Randle is playing really well, like he is this season, he's indispensable to them. The return that you're going to get for him is not worth it to make them as much worse in the present as it would take for them to trade him, right? And when he's having a down season like he was last year, then teams aren't calling about him. They don't want him. So it's just hard to envision a trade and a context that makes sense for a Julius Randle trade. And as long as Randle is there, and as long as the Knicks have Mitchell Robinson, who also is under contract for 3 more years after this one, and Jericho Sims, and Isaiah Hartenstein, they have put this in a position to where Obi Toppin is just going to kind of be the straight backup 4. And sometimes he's going to play 10 minutes, and sometimes he's going to play 20 minutes. So it's often not going to be much more than that. The role they see him in is more of a spot-up shooter than anything else. I do think that it's a little bit on him to cut more and dribble handoff more like we saw last year and earlier in the season. And that might be a way for him to get some more activity and some more buckets. But I think we've seen that, like, the Knicks believe, and not wrongfully so, the Knicks believe that the point of the New York Knicks is for the New York Knicks to do what's best for the New York Knicks, not necessarily to do what's best for Obi Toppin at all times. But what's in contrast is that it's not always what's best for Toppin. And it is pretty jarring to see them draft a number 8 guy and him to show flashes and for him to really not quite get the opportunity. But Tom Thibodeau, as he's made very, very clear, he believes his ethos is you need rim protection on the floor. And playing Toppin and Randle together would mean not having a conventional rim protector out there. That's not just what he says. That's how he builds his defenses. The Knicks have defensive schemes that are more dependent on having a dude who blocks shots and scares away dribblers than maybe any other team in the league, certainly as much as any other team in the league. And they need guys like that in order to execute their defensive schemes. And that's why Toppin kind of gets the limited playing time. But I think as long as he's sort of stuck in this system and with a roster resembling this one, I think we're going to kind of continue to see him play this sort of role. I don't really see him jumping out of it.
We'll all keep an eye on Toppin's minutes going forward. But Fred, you will always have minutes available to you on this show. Michael, you as well. Fred, Mike, we really appreciate you guys coming on with us to talk Knicks. And we are going to have 3 shows next week for the trade deadline. We're going to have Tuesday and Wednesday putbacks live at 1 p.m. next week. And then we're going to have a special trade deadline show Thursday, 3 p.m. right at the buzzer. As things conclude, we'll be here to talk about it. So we're going to see you guys, hopefully, for those 3 shows next week. We're looking forward to it. I'm Ian Begley. And again, 3 shows next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, breaking down the trade deadline here on the Putback.